Right. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Australian War Memorial and to BAE Systems Theatre. Shortly we will have the privilege to hear again. It seems like only yesterday, but it's 4 years now since we've had Margaret here to speak to us, and we look forward to it very much. And she will be introduced by the Canadian High Commissioner Paul Maddison. I'd like now to do two things. Firstly, to reflect the significance of the work that you have done and the interest in it by listing the VIPs that have chosen to come today, Margaret. And second is to confirm what the diplomats from other countries already know, is the appalling understanding that Australians have of the correct pronunciation of people's names from other cultures. So, firstly, of course, I welcome His Excellency Paul Maddison, the Canadian High Commissioner to Australia and a great friend of our country. His Excellency Mr A.M. Gondane, the Indian High Commissioner to Australia. His Excellency Mr James Buono Miranda, the Ambassador of the Republic of Colombia. His Excellency Mr Miguel Palomino de la Gala, the Ambassador from Peru. His Excellency Mr Milorad Petrovic, the Ambassador of Serbia. Mr James Caruso, the Charge d'Affaires of the United States, long serving in that role and doing a wonderful job for the United States. Mr Lale Lonsdaze, the Charge d'Affaires of the Embassy of Georgia. The Deputy Head of Mission for the Embassy of Greece, representing the Ambassador, Mr Ferentinos. Also the Deputy Head of Mission, Mohammed Farid Zakaria, the Deputy Head of Mission for the High Commission of Malaysia, representing the High Commissioner. Mr Vince de Petro, no, not representing Italy on this occasion, but the Chief Executive, Lockheed Martin Australia, who's given an enormous amount of support to the memorial here. I'd also welcome Mr Nick Mitsovic, who is the recently appointed Director of the National Gallery of Australia, and Professor Brendan Sargent, the Honorary Professor of Strategic and Defence Studies at ANU. And I also see one of our great Australians and historians, Peter Burness here, and our Head of History, of course, Ashley Eakins. Welcome to all of you here to the Australian War Memorial. This place is one of the three key institutions in our country that emerged from the First World War, its origins being in the bloody fighting of 1916 at Pozières in France, observed from the Gallipoli landing to Montbarain and the armistice by the official correspondent Charles Bean. And he conceived and then resolved at its end he would build this, what he described as the finest memorial in his museum to the men of the Australian Imperial Force and to the nurses. The First World War was many things to all of the countries that were involved, but for us it was certainly a war that changed us. We as Australians went into that war only federated in 1901, but still regarding ourselves very much as British. We emerged from the war, victorious but inconsolably mourning our 62,000 dead, but given a greater belief in ourselves and in the longer term, from it a deeper understanding of what it means to be an Australian. In 2014, the then Chief of the Australian Army, Lieutenant General David Morrison, stood in the commemorative area around that pool of reflection in the early morning light on the occasion of the Army's birthday to address 400 of his uniformed personnel. And he said to them that we would need to prepare for the long peace, that as with following the Vietnam War, that Australia had entered and could foresee a very long period of low operational tempo. I said to him after that address, I said, David, I hope you're right, but I think you're wrong. Only 3 years later, a former Chief of the Australian Defence Force, Admiral Chris Barry, he said in a major public address that he believed that we were, and I quote, sleepwalking toward war. And I said to him, I hope you are right, but I hope you are wrong, but I fear you may be right. And therein lies much of the importance of what Professor Macmillan will be saying to us today, and which draws on her considerable writings. One of the guests who's come here today, Margaret, asked me, is she going to talk about the future and the prevention of war? And it's not my place to know what you will be speaking about, but in understanding the origins of wars and how they've changed us, it has everything to do with the future. I'd now like to welcome His Excellency Paul Maddison, the Canadian High Commissioner, to introduce Margaret. And following Margaret's address, I will moderate Q&A. So if the question's a bit hard, I'll ignore them, of course, Margaret. And Margaret's very happy to take questions at the conclusion of her address, of course. Thank you, Paul.
Well, Excellencies, Professor Macmillan, Dr. Nelson, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you so much for choosing to be here with us this afternoon for what I'm sure will be a memorable presentation and Q&A session with Margaret Macmillan. Brendan, it's always a pleasure to be with you anywhere, and especially here at this magnificent Australian War Memorial. I have heard you speak on so many occasions over the past 3 years, going back to the Merchant Mariner commemorative event on Lake Burley Griffin in September of 2015. And I've always learned something from you, even as we have today. Some particular anecdote, some poignant anecdote about an airman, about a digger, a sailor, their families or their mates. And each time you've added, at least for me, a new sort of bright thread to this Australian tapestry of service, gallantry, sacrifice, and mateship. And through your passion and your leadership for those who have served and their families, you have made it clear each and every day that this memorial and all that it represents lies at the very heart and soul of the Australian experience. And I would just like to congratulate you, Brendan, for your service to Australia. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Nelson, also for inviting Professor Macmillan again to speak to us here at the War Memorial. Margaret is a remarkable Canadian, a companion of the Order of Canada, and an internationally renowned historian. She possesses an amazing ability to bring history to life, to bring the personalities, the passions, and the subtle cultural nuances of the times she's describing to life in a way that keeps readers compelled to turn page after page and keeps readers excited about the new insights they are learning. The first book of Margaret's that I read was Paris 1919, although I think the title out front here is Peace. But the book that I first read was titled Paris 1919. Of course, it's about the Treaty of Versailles, which was published to much acclaim and to many prizes back in 2001. And I have literally not stopped talking about that book since I read it, and especially here in Australia, because it helped me connect some really important dots. It taught me about the emergence through the horrendous sacrifice that Brendan referred to, 62,000 Australians, 66,000 Canadians who fell in Europe in the Great War. Their horrendous sacrifice, but also the innovative leadership of the Australian and the Canadian Expeditionary Forces as shock troops critical to victory under the independent commands of Generals Sir John Monash and Sir Arthur Currie. And it is that experience that earned Canada and Australia a place at the table in Versailles. And it enabled Prime Ministers Billy Hughes and Robert Borden to walk in confident in the knowledge that their leadership, their sacrifice, their engagement, and in fact their critical contribution to victory in 1918 had earned them a place and earned them the privilege of sitting down with the other powers to shape the grand design of the 20th century. And in a sense, Canada and Australia as young dominions came of age together at Versailles. And that is a lesson that I've learned from Margaret, and is one that I've shared at every opportunity while I've been here in Australia. Margaret, of course, has written many other books, including The War That Ended Peace, The Road to 1914. And so, in a sense, she has bookended the Great War and contributed greatly to our collective understanding of the war's causes and of its enduring consequences. So it's only fitting then that Margaret is here with us almost 100 years to the day since the beginning of the 100 Days Offensive that ultimately led to the armistice in 1918. Margaret Macmillan was educated at the University of Toronto and the University of Oxford. She was a member of Ryerson University's History Department for 25 years, Provost of Trinity College at the University of Toronto from 2002 until 2007, Warden of St. Anthony's College and Professor of International History at the University of Oxford from 2007 to 2017. She is an Emeritus Professor of International History at the University of Oxford, Professor of History at the University of Toronto, the Zeros Foundation Distinguished Scholar at the Henry Kissinger Center for Global Affairs at Johns Hopkins University, and a Distinguished Fellow of the Munk School of Global Affairs in Toronto. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Margaret Macmillan to talk about war and the making of the modern world.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I think Canadians are always kind to each other, so you've been very kind. Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be here again. I was here in 2014 talking about the beginnings of the war, and I'm now going to talk about war more generally, because I think war is something that we need to think about, and we need to understand, and we need to try and understand how they start, how they continue, how difficult it is to control war once it starts, and how we have made, of course, many attempts throughout history to try and control war, and how difficult it is to end war. And I think we also need to look at the ways in which war has shaped our societies, and the ways in which our societies have shaped war, because it's a two-way relationship. Particular kinds of societies fight particular kinds of wars on particular kinds of issues. Some societies will fight religious wars, some societies will fight ideological wars, some societies will have wars that are fought really almost entirely by military caste, at the wish of particular leaders. Other societies will have wars in which everyone in some way or other is engaged. And so what sort of society you have affects the sort of war you fight. And then, of course, the war itself is going to affect what happens to your society. We tend, I think, to look at war as something that is an aberration. We look at it, particularly, I think, those of us who come from very peaceful countries, and many of us do. Many of us have enjoyed what people refer to as the long peace since 1945. A lot of other people, of course, have not enjoyed that long peace. But I think a lot of us here probably know what peace is, what a long period of peace can be like. And I think we tend, as a result, to assume that war is something that happens when normal things break down, that war is an aberration, that war is something that is not the normal state of affairs. It's an inversion, an upturning of all that is normal, and that all we really want to do is get back to normality. In other words, peace as soon as possible. I think we need to look at war more seriously than that. I think we need to look at it as something that has been deeply embedded and intertwined in human history and in the development of human societies. I'm not going to argue that war is a natural thing that human beings do, but it is something we do an awful lot of. And I think if we tend just to put it in a box and say, oh, it's something that happened, we don't really want to think about it very much, or we'll leave it to the military historians and the military experts to think about, I think we are cutting ourselves off from something that is very important indeed to try and understand. Because I think if we don't understand war, then we don't have much hope of trying to control it, trying to keep it under control, trying to prevent it, and of course, trying to end it. Now, there are a great many debates about why we as a species fight, which I'll not get into because they would take another series of lectures. But one of the debates is whether it is something that is embedded in us. Are we programmed to fight? Is it something that evolution has left us with, that we are a species that tend to fight? And there are biologists and ethnographers and anthropologists who would argue that. I tend to disagree simply because I think we're not pre-programmed to do anything. We may have certain traits, certain tendencies, but we're also rational, reasonable beings, and we can control some of what might be our natural instincts. But it certainly is true that our species has fought an awful lot, and our closest cousins in the natural world, the chimpanzees, tend to fight over territory. Almost every type of chimpanzee tends to fight in an organized way, and that's really what war is. It is the organization of people or beings or animals that will fight in an organized way to apply violence to those who are their opponents, to force those opponents to do what they want. There is only one species, as far as I know, of chimpanzees who don't fight. They're called the bonobos. The bonobos find other ways of interacting, which I'll spare you because what they do is not suitable for family listening. But it is possible that there is something in our makeup that makes us predisposed to fight. That doesn't mean we have to fight, but there may well be something that makes us want to organize ourselves in ways to force others to do what we want through the application of organized violence. There's another argument, again a very interesting one, which again would take another lecture, that we didn't fight much when we were hunter-gatherers. When we were hunter-gatherers, what we tended to do was simply move away if there was conflict or if we felt threatened, because there was usually space. In hunter-gatherer societies, there was almost always the opportunity of simply leaving, withdrawing, moving somewhere else, not getting into conflict. And the argument goes that once we settled down and became an agricultural species, once we began to cultivate land, then we had something that we couldn't pick up and move easily. We couldn't simply move away because we'd be moving away from what sustained us. We had, in other words, something to defend. And once we had something to defend, worth defending whether it was food, cultivated land, eventually domesticated animals, buildings, then of course it was also something that others might want to come and take. So that as soon as we settled down, so the argument goes, and you can make up your own minds on it, we became organized and we became violent, that we began to organize ourselves in ways to either defend what we had or to take what others had. And this is an old debate. It goes back a long way. Were we corrupted by becoming organized? As soon as we became organized into societies, did we then begin to become the types of species, or did we then begin to make war? It isn't something that I can settle today, but I think it shows how very complicated the arguments about war are. There are, I think, complications too in our attitudes towards war. I think we have very ambivalent attitudes towards conflict. I think we tend to deplore it, but I think we are also sometimes aware of the power of war, the glamour of war, the attraction of conflict. I mean, many societies have admired those who fight. They have elevated the warrior to a particular position in society. They have elevated the qualities that warriors have. You think of certain societies, the Prussian Junker class in Prussia for centuries believed that it was a noble thing for young men to fight, and that it was a noble thing for people to be prepared to sacrifice their lives for their king or for a greater cause. And you get similar warrior castes and warrior values in other societies as well. And I think we have complicated views. I mean, if you go to a bookshop, you will see row after row after row of books about war. Or if any of you play video games, you don't all play video games a lot of the time, but if you play video games, the most popular ones are usually about war. And so I think we have complicated feelings towards war. We don't know where it comes from. We're not sure if it's ingrained in us or in our societies. And we're not entirely sure what our attitudes towards it are. We deplore it, but at times we also, I think, admire it. There are also, I think, a couple of paradoxes about war that I'd like to just call your attention to. One is that war can produce bigger societies, what Hobbes called the Leviathan, that through war, governments become stronger. Over time, and this certainly happened in many societies, governments acquired a monopoly of violence. What that did was actually make society more peaceful for many people within it. That if you lived in a big political unit where the government had a monopoly of violence, you didn't have to worry that someone from the next village or someone living in that castle was going to come and plunder you or put you to the sword or take your women and children, rape them, kill them, take them into slavery. That there was a central authority that had been established, often through organized violence, through war, but nevertheless in the long run provided peace. The Roman Empire was established through violence. Its borders were pushed out often through violence. But if you lived within the Roman Empire, and all the evidence now seems to be tending in this direction, if you lived within the Roman Empire, you were likely to live longer. You were likely to eat better because trade could move freely between different parts of the Roman Empire. You were likely, in other words, to enjoy a relatively peaceable standard of living. And it is very striking that through history, people tried to get into the Roman Empire rather than escape from it. They came into this organization not because they were looking for freedom necessarily, not because they were necessarily looking for democratic government, because they were looking for peace, because they were looking for the opportunity to go about their lives. So that war can, and it is paradoxical, I think, it can produce often what we would consider, I think, beneficial results. That through producing strong central governments with a monopoly on violence, it actually made it possible for people, many people, to live in comparative peace. Not everyone, and you didn't, of course, want to cross such governments, but they did provide a sort of order and stability when you think of how long the Roman Empire lasted and the sort of stability it provided. Or the successive Chinese empires, which for all that the Chinese say about having always been a peaceable sort of people, the Chinese empires were built and maintained often by violence. I mean, China did not become larger and larger just through peaceable means. It became larger and larger, in many cases through war, and those borders and the Great Wall of China were often maintained by armed forces. So that armed force can produce peaceful societies. We perhaps choose to produce them in other ways, but this is something that has happened. And what also can happen through war, and again, we might not choose to do it in this way, is that you can get very real progress. You can get progress both domestically and internationally. And so, war can produce advances in the position of certain people in society as war became more and more complicated. In the 19th century, for example, in Europe, it became important for governments to train the civilians who were going to become soldiers, to give them an education, for example. The spread of literacy and the spread of public education in European countries had a great deal to do with helping to produce those who could become better soldiers, helping to make them better soldiers. The spread of public health, the spread of public benefits, again, had a great deal to do with governments wanting to treat those who are going to become soldiers better. Now, we wouldn't choose necessarily to bring about such change through war, but the importance of war, I think, should not be underestimated in the sorts of changes that it has brought about in societies. Just to give you one more example, in the 1860s, the Russian Tsar, Alexander II, in the wake of a major defeat in the Crimean War, Russia was defeated, decided to abolish serfdom. And one of the reasons, perhaps the key reason he decided to abolish serfdom, was because he felt that free peasants would fight more willingly for Russia, that they would be more independent, they would make better soldiers. And he decided also to spend very scarce government resources on education. And again, that was in order to try and overcome Russia's backwardness, to try and produce the sorts of soldiers that would help Russia in future not be defeated. You think of the results of both world wars, the changes that those brought in the position of women or the working class. In Britain, even before the war was ending in 1918, a Representation Act was passed which gave for the first time the vote to women. Now, the arguments, as most of you will probably know, that had been made against giving women the votes before 1914 was that there wasn't much point. They would only do what their husbands and their fathers told them to do. So you'd get twice as many votes and you'd just have to count them, but you wouldn't get any change in the distribution of those votes. And the other argument, which again you're probably familiar with, was that even if women did try and exercise their right to vote, they wouldn't know what they were talking about. They wouldn't know what they were voting about. They weren't involved in society. They wouldn't have the capacity. I mean, they were very good, of course, at darning and knitting and cooking and looking after the household, but they couldn't vote on great issues of state. They couldn't vote on whether Britain should have this sort of budget or that sort of budget, or this sort of government or that sort of government. And of course, what the First World War did is simply undercut a lot of those arguments, because the demand for manpower, and it was mostly manpower in the First World War, was so great that men had to leave the offices and the factories and the jobs that they'd been doing, and women had to do those jobs. And by the end of the war, it was no longer possible to say, well, women can't do those sort of jobs. They're just not equipped to do it, because they were doing them. And so the government, in recognition, and many of the politicians who had opposed women's suffrage before 1914, by 1918, were saying, we have to give them the vote. They moved cautiously, however. They didn't give all women the vote. They gave only women of the age of 30 and over the vote. And gradually they then did extend it down to younger women. But it did make a real difference, as did the Second World War, in the position of women. It was seen that they were capable of doing the sorts of activities and jobs and participating in societies in ways that they simply had not been considered capable of in earlier periods. And the same thing is true of labor. Unions were recognized, wages were improved, and again, it was, of course, often under pressure. But if governments in demanding, tremendously demanding and draining wars like the First and Second World Wars could not keep their very large working classes on side, then they weren't going to be able to sustain the war effort. And so you saw real changes in society as a result of war. And you can think of other changes, I'm sure all of you, but tremendous advances in things like science and technology, things that would seem too expensive to do in peacetime suddenly become possible in wartime. For example, penicillin. It was discovered how to make penicillin in the 1920s, but it was considered too expensive to do. No drug company wanted to do it, no government wanted to fund it. It was simply something that was seen as much too expensive to produce. The war came and suddenly it seemed very different. It became very important to be able to look after the soldiers who were wounded, to be able to treat them, to be able to repair them, to be able sometimes to send them back into battle, and it suddenly didn't seem that expensive anymore. The same thing is, of course, with the development of the atom and the splitting of the atom. This was something that seemed improbable and too expensive before the Second World War. In the course of the Second World War, it came to be seen as something that government, particularly the American government, but also the British government and the Canadian government and the Australian government, really wanted to happen. And so war can bring, and again, I don't think we choose to do it this way, but war can bring very real progress. It also, and I was talking to the Canadian High Commissioner before this, and to Brendan Nelson before when we were standing outside. It can also make real changes to society in leveling out inequality. It's a very interesting new book by a man called Walter Scheidel. The book is called The Great Leveler. And he said you only get a compression of inequality between the extremes of the very rich and the very poor. You only get a compression in societies when there's a real crisis. And that crisis can be a dreadful plague, which carries people off, and suddenly labor becomes much more important, and so you have to pay people better. Or it can be a collapse of society when suddenly everyone is more or less going to be equal, or it can be war. And that is, if you look at and he argues this very well, if you look at what happened between about 1914 and 1960 in Western societies engaged in the Great Wars and on both sides. If you look at what happened in Japan as much as what happened in the United States or Canada and Australia or Britain, there is a real compression in income. The very rich are taxed very heavily to help pay for the war, and they understand that they have to be taxed, and it is socially acceptable to tax them heavily. And the very poor are given benefits because it's very important to keep them in the war effort. We're now coming out of that period, and we're seeing, I think, a growth of inequality. And we have to hope that we don't get another war which is going to change that. But war does bring these unforeseen consequences. And it also brings them internationally. We, I think, as a species often need, if I could make any generalization about us as a species, we often need a great disaster to make us think about doing things in a different way. And after prolonged periods of war, you have had people saying, statespeople, thinkers, philosophers, you've had people saying, look, we cannot go on doing it like this. And so at the end of the 30 Years' War, that dreadful war which destroyed so much of the center of Europe between 1618 and 1648, you got a series of agreements which collectively are known as the Peace of Westphalia, in which governments, peoples who had been each other's bitter enemies for 30 years, said we can't go on like this. We have to find some other way of dealing internationally with, say, religious issues. And so it was agreed in those agreements that governments would respect each other's sovereignty. In other words, they would not interfere in the internal affairs of each other. Now, we can disapprove or approve of that, but it made a very big difference. It meant that the sort of misery that Europe had been through in both the 16th and the 17th centuries, with governments interfering to protect Protestants in a Catholic country or to protect Catholics in a Protestant country, that disappeared. And so Europe enjoyed, for a period, relative peace. The same thing happened after the wars of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Almost as soon as France had its revolution in 1789, its enemies began to gather, And the French themselves began to become crusaders for their revolution and to move out beyond their borders. And so a series of conflicts started very shortly after 1789, which only ended, which of course then turned into the Napoleonic Wars, and only ended with the defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. The Congress of Vienna met and a series of agreements was drawn up, which provided Europe with relative peace, at least for the first half of the 19th century, and sometimes a bit beyond. And you got the major powers in Europe coming together in what was called the Concert of Europe, agreeing that they would meet every so often. There was nothing terribly organized about this, but they would meet every so often, and they would try and limit conflicts. They'd try and dampen conflicts. If two countries, maybe big, maybe small, got into a conflict, the Concert of Europe would come together and sit down around a table and try and end that conflict. Or if revolution, it was a fairly conservative organization, if revolution was going to break out, and it was breaking out across Europe, in many cases, 1848, for example, if revolution broke out, again, the Concert of Europe would come together and try and dampen down that revolution and keep some sort of stability and order. And what you also began to get in the 19th century was talk about other ways, and I'll talk about these in a moment, of trying to encourage peace. We got the same thing after the First World War. People came to Paris in 1919, and there'd been a lot of discussion before the great leaders arrived in Paris and the smaller leaders arrived. There'd been a lot of discussion about how we can avoid a repetition of the First World War, because the First World War was seen as something so appalling and so catastrophic. People felt that society, civilization could not withstand another such war. I mean, they were not to know that there was going to be another such war. I think in 1918, they thought we can never do this again. We have destroyed so much, and we have caused such damage to ourselves and to the world. We cannot go on doing this. And so after the Great War of 1914-18, there was a lot of public support and a lot of talk about other ways of trying to settle international relations and trying to keep them peaceable. And that is out of that the League of Nations came. And then again, of course, we know that we did get another dreadful war, and in 1945 you got again an attempt to create international structures that would save the world from this sort of conflict ever again. And that is why we got things such as the United Nations and the Bretton Woods institutions. And so war, we all know its destructive capacity, which of course has been growing rather than getting less. But war is something that can produce more stable domestic societies, can produce real benefits within those societies, from social change to scientific and technological change, and can produce very important international change. And again, I want to stress, we wouldn't choose to do it in this way. This is a very costly way to do it. But war can produce benefits. And of course, the question for us is how to get those benefits without going to war. How do we focus our attention in such a way on making changes in our own societies and making changes internationally that will enable us to do the sorts of things that, sadly, in the past, war has seemed to be the only mechanism for encouraging or doing. I want to talk a bit about the very dramatic changes in war in the 19th century, because there have been various periods in human history where there have been suddenly great changes. And the introduction of gunpowder was one, when you got a real change in the technology of war and you began to get a change in the way it was fighting, the way it was fought. Or earlier on, the introduction of the archer as a weapon against the knight on horseback, and that made a real change in war. But change, it seems to me, has been getting quicker and more encompassing, and some of the great change began to happen in the 19th century. And there were two really important changes in the 19th century, I think, and you can all, of course, think of others, but the two that seem to me are extremely important is one in the nature of society and in the nature of those who are doing the fighting, and the second is in the industrial capacity of societies and the science and technology of those societies. So let me talk first of all about the changes in society and why that affected fighting. And of course, one of the key changes came with the French Revolution. And these were ideas that had been around before. And these were ideas that were there in the American War of Independence. They were floating around Europe, that government should not be despotic, that those who happened to inherit a throne did not necessarily have a right to that throne. They had an obligation to the people in the country over which they're ruling. And increasingly in the 18th century, you began to get the idea that people should have some say in their own government. Maybe not all people, maybe only people who own property, maybe only people who had a certain amount of money, but there should be some contract between those who are doing the ruling and those who are being ruled over, and that those who are being ruled over are not just inert subjects who are there to be told what to do, there to be pushed around, that they actually have some say in the society and in the government in which they live. And the French Revolution, of course, brought this out into the open in a very, very dramatic way. And what you got, and it happened in France, but it began to happen in other countries around the world, what you got was the transformation of what had been the subject. Someone was just a subject, you're the subject of a king or a queen or an emperor or an empress. You have no say in who rules over you. What began to happen is the subject became a citizen. And the citizen was someone, and it was usually a man in those days, but gradually the idea that women could be citizens as well began to become part of the public discussion. What began to happen was that people began to talk of citizens who have a right to choose their government, who have an obligation to be involved in the affairs of state, in the choice of their government. And that became very important. And of course, it was a two-way thing, because if you're a citizen and you have some say in your government, then you also have an obligation to it. And this became very, very clear in the French Revolution. I mean, the early days of the French Revolution, suddenly people were becoming citizens. I mean, the French called each other citoyenne and citoyenne, the masculine and the feminine. This was the way they addressed each other in those early radical stages of the French Revolution. And the government, the revolutionary governments, began to call on them. In 1792, as France was being menaced by its conservative opponents, and it had many conservative opponents, among them Austria, the Austrian Empire, and Prussia, as France was being menaced by these outside forces, the government issued a call for something called the levée en masse. You have all got to come to the defense of the revolution, of the revolutionary government. And there was a proclamation that was read out in the squares, and it said the men must be prepared to fight, the women must encourage them to fight and make the bandages, the children must be prepared to be messengers, and the old men should have themselves carried into the squares in order to tell stories of valiant deeds to inspire those who are going to fight. What this meant, of course, not everybody rushed to do this. I mean, societies don't change overnight, but there was a new atmosphere and a new feeling about, and it appalled the French opponents. They'd never seen anything like it. I mean, 18th century soldiers tended to be either, if they were officers, they came from a particular social class, a landed gentry or aristocratic class. Ordinary soldiers were usually the dregs of society. They were the people you didn't have any use for any other way. They were people, often in England, if you had committed a crime, you were given the choice of going to jail or being executed or going into the army. It was that sort of person who went into the army as an ordinary soldier. And pubs in England would have signs saying, "No dogs, no soldiers." You know, these were seen as really very dangerous, very violent, close to being criminals. You didn't want them around. And of course, they didn't want to be soldiers necessarily. I mean, if you're given a choice between going to jail or being executed and you're a soldier, you're not going to necessarily be the most enthusiastic of soldiers. And what it meant, for example, was that armies had to spend a lot of time guarding their own soldiers. When they camped, they couldn't march at night often, because if they marched at night, it was a very good time for the soldiers simply to run away. If they camped at night, they put guards around the camp, but it was not often to protect them from attacks from outside. It was to prevent the soldiers from within from running away. So there were certain things you could do with these soldiers. You could drill them, you could terrify them, you could drive them into battle. You often had to drive them into battle. But you couldn't expect them to show much initiative for obvious reasons. What the French revolutionary soldiers did, and this appalled their opponents who still had the old-style armies, was they didn't seem to know the meaning of fear. And they didn't seem to know the meaning of impossible attacks. And so in the early wars of the French Revolution, you get their opponents saying, you know, we're waiting for the French to attack. They should march out into the field in nice orders. But they didn't. They came rushing out in a pell-mell, sort of helter-skelter group, and they ran up hills. They shouted. They didn't behave properly. They didn't know when to stop. Said one foreign officer, it was like seeing a pack of savage beasts. And the conservative armies rather tended to withdraw when they saw this. They didn't know how to handle it. And you could march French soldiers at night because they weren't going to run away. They were motivated now by the revolution, by a desire to defend France. And so you get a very new type of warfare, new type of soldier, as a result of the changes in society. And gradually, other countries around Europe began to have to make changes, because if they couldn't inspire the same sorts of feelings in their soldiers, they weren't going to be able to cope with the French revolutionary soldiers. And so the growth of this relationship, this new sort of relationship between the governed and the governed, was going to make a difference to war. What was also going to make a difference, of course, was with the spread of literacy, with the spread of communications, more and more people felt themselves to be a part of the nation. You know, in France, it's been estimated that something like 9/10 of the population in France at the time of the French Revolution didn't speak French, because they all lived in their areas, they spoke their regional languages. With the spread of universal education, and this happened, of course, partly as a result of the French Revolution, but also with the spread of new means of communications in the 19th century, education was making these different groups of French into French people. And they were learning about their country, and they were now beginning to share in its history. They were beginning to see themselves as part of a larger unit. And this was happening all over the world. The spread of communications was making it possible for people to imagine themselves as part of this thing called the nation. And so what you got, and it really is stimulated by the French Revolution, but it was certainly probably going to happen anyway, is you got a real spread of nationalism in the 19th century. This feeling that your nation is really important to you, that you are somehow part of it, that your family have always been part of it, and that you owe it something. It is something bigger than you. It will survive, outlive you. And so nationalism is something that grows very, very markedly in the 19th century. And it grows partly because of people like me, because of historians. Historians created national histories, often false or one-sided or very dubious when they came to the evidence, but very persuasive. And so you got, long before there was a Germany, you got German historians and others arguing there had always been something called a German people, and therefore they should have their own country. Or you got French historians saying, well, they've always been the French. They've always been different from the Germans. They've always been superior, of course, to the Germans. I mean, that went without saying. And you got German historians saying the same sorts of things. And you got British historians, or sometimes English historians. It depended on the perspective. You got Russian historians. And so you get a growth of this national feeling. And this also contributes to making war very different. It becomes more difficult for governments to act coolly and back down when somehow the national honour is at stake. The Marquess of Salisbury, who was a great conservative Prime Minister of Britain in the late 1880s and 1890s, once said, I don't like this thing called public opinion. He said, it's like having a gigantic lunatic asylum at my back. I'm constantly being pushed to do things I don't want to do. Suddenly it becomes important. There was a huge dispute over some, I shouldn't say obscure, but rather small islands, the Samoan Islands, between Britain and Germany in the, I think it was 1880s. And as one German, it became hugely important for the Germans to get their fair share of the Samoan Islands. And there were huge Solomon Islands, I think it was, I apologize, huge sort of public outcry in Germany. And as one German commentator said, most people in Germany couldn't tell you where these islands are. But suddenly it's become important for the German nation to have them. And so the growth of nationalism begins to affect the capacities of governments to make decisions. It begins to limit the sort of decisions they can make because they're being pushed by their own people. And what you get also is a growth of quasi or fake scientific theories in the late 19th century. Social Darwinism, the misapplication of Darwinian theories to human affairs. People saying, it's like species in the wild. They have natural predators. We have natural predators. We the French have to look out for the Germans because they've always been opposed to us, or we the Germans have to look out to the French because they've always hated us. And this is something that people said very seriously. We are bound to fight each other because we are different species. And so you get a very different attitude towards war. As a great German general, not the General von Moltke who presided over the rather catastrophic opening moves of the First World War for Germany, but his uncle, who had presided over the German wars of unification, his uncle said in his last public statement, we are moving from cabinet wars, where cabinets made decisions about whether or not to go to war, and if they did so for very clear and limited reasons. We're moving from those sorts of wars to the people's wars. And he said they're going to be dreadful. He said they're going to be much worse. They're going to be much more savage. They're going to have much more hatred in them. And he said such wars will last for a very long time. He said they could last for as long as 7 years. He said, woe be to him who sets that match alight. And in a way, he didn't live to see what happened in 1914, but he was foreseeing something that was likely to happen. And so you get a very different sense about war, that it's now something that a nation might have to do, might want to do, might be obliged to do because of what it is. And of course, what's happening at the same time is war itself is getting much more deadly. And the capacity of nations now to put a lot of people into the field, to feed them, to equip them, to keep them there, to move them around, is now much greater than it was in the 18th century. And what used to limit armies in the old days was basically what limits clouds of locusts. A cloud of locusts comes in and starts eating a crop. It eats the whole crop. There's nothing left to eat, so it has to move on or simply die. And that's what armies used to be like. They had to live off the land. It's very difficult. You couldn't keep supplying them because the horses you needed consumed huge amounts of food themselves. And so an army had to live off the land. If it was in a rich country, it could live fairly well for a while. But sooner or later, it would eat everything within a 50-mile radius, and it would have to move on. And that limited how long armies could stay in the field. It also limited their size. What happened in the 19th century was that railways, steamships, factories, the productive capacities of societies grew enormously, and it made it possible to have much bigger armies, move them into the field, and keep them there for much longer. So I'll just give you one set of statistics. In 1812, Napoleon went into Russia with an army of something like 600,000, the biggest army, I think, that really had ever been seen in Europe. It went into Russia. What happened, of course, is what happened to Hitler. The winter came, and the Russians retreated. They did a scorched earth policy, and the French began to starve, and their allies began to starve. And that army eventually straggled back out of Russia. I think there were less than 100,000 came back out of that massive army. The rest starved to death, died, or were killed by the Russians. But it was a big army, given the technology and capacity of the time. In 1870, when Europe had been transformed by the industrial and scientific revolutions, the German Confederation brought an army of something like 1.5 million into the field against France. And that was thanks to the changes in society. And in 1914, when the First World War started, the Germans were able to put an army of over 3 million into the field. And of course, what made the First World War last so long was that once the armies were in the field, it was possible to keep them there and keep rotating soldiers in and out and keep the food coming and keep the supplies coming and keep the ammunition coming, because the productive capacity of European societies was now so great. And so war began to change also because of the production capacities of European societies, and of course they were making much better weapons. They were getting new explosives, better metals, much better equipment, much better guns. I mean, there are experts here who know much more than I, and these statistics are always tricky, but probably the old-style musket, which most armies would be equipped with in the period before about 1840, was accurate up to about 100 yards. And after that, you couldn't be sure that what you were firing would actually hit someone. And then you had to reload. You had to reload standing up, which meant you were a very good target. So if you'd missed your shot, someone else had a very good chance of hitting you. By the middle of the century, armies increasingly were moving over to weapons that could be loaded lying down, increasingly rifled weapons, which were much more accurate, and they had better explosives, and they had better metals, so they were able to fire further. By the time of the First World War, a standard infantry rifle probably, and I can be corrected by the expert, could probably hit someone at 1,000 yards if necessary. So this makes a very different sort of war. The capacity to kill is much greater. And of course, there are new kinds of weapons, repeating rifles, so you don't have to reload every time, machine guns, which can fire dozens of bullets a moment, huge improvements in field artillery, in the sorts of weapons that are being used. The destructive capacity is now much greater, which is why we get the beginnings of such hideous losses. Now, European armies were aware of this. They looked at it. They saw that war was changing. But it's very difficult and it was very difficult for those in charge to imagine fighting in different ways. And so they looked at the American Civil War, where the losses were terrible, where it was clear that it was getting easier to defend a position than to attack it. A lot of Europeans came to observe the American Civil War. And they said, well, yes, war is getting more deadly, but after all, it's the Americans fighting and it's a civil war, so it doesn't count. And they looked at other wars in Europe and they said, well, yes, but it doesn't really count. I mean, when Russia fought Turkey, well, it's Russia, it's rather backward, Turkey's rather backward. Yes, there were dreadful losses, but it's those two. And then in 1904, 1905, there was the Russo-Japanese War, where the Japanese, in the end, won, but they took dreadful losses when they attacked well-defended Russian positions in Manchuria. And again, it was said, well, it's the Russians, they were hopeless. And look, the Japanese won. And they did take losses. So we just have to get our soldiers used to the idea of taking even more losses. And you've got all sorts of calculations. If you have a soldier defending a well-defended position, you need 10 soldiers to get him out. And you may have to lose half of those in the attack. But you just have to train the soldiers to expect that. And so changing attitudes towards war and how to fight it was very, very difficult indeed. But of course, not everyone in the 19th century was saying we must fight. And what you got in the 19th century, as the war changed and as society changed, was you also got people saying, we shouldn't be doing war anymore. Look at what we're doing. We're productive. We have all these wonderful factories. We've got all these wonderful inventions. We have made such progress that we're more civilized now. We don't do war anymore. War is something that people over there do, or people in Africa do, or people in Asia do, or people in the Americas do. We don't do war because we're too civilized. And so there's real hope by the end of the 19th century that war was becoming obsolete. So on the one hand, you had much greater war-making capacity, and the military still, of course, planning for war, but you also had a feeling at large in society was that war was something that shouldn't happen, that it was improbable, if not unthinkable, that it should happen in this advanced progressive Europe. And you got tremendous support for ways of settling disputes short of war. And you got tremendous support for disarmament conferences, tremendous support for trying to deal with the war-making capacity of human beings and their societies and trying to find other ways of dealing with these issues. And so you got tremendous support, for example, international arbitration, where two countries agree that they will work together, they'll submit their dispute, whether it's over land or some incident that's happened, they will submit that dispute to an independent arbiter, and they will agree to accept the ruling of that arbiter. Now, something like 300 arbitrations were held between 1790 and 1914. More than half of those arbitrations took place after 1890. So if you're a European, or if you're someone who lives anywhere in the world, you'll say, look, the world is really changing. Yes, we have this appalling war-making capacity, but we've also got this change in international thinking. We've got these new institutions, and the world is much more linked together. And so I think what we see in the Europe of the 19th century, we see many of the things we're dealing with today. Very rapid social change, conflict and reasons for conflict still there, often very strong nationalistic feelings. I mean, I think we see these in our world today, and we have this tension and this balance between forces that might push for war or say that war is going to happen or that war is something that we can use as an instrument of state, and those who say, no, we've moved beyond it. We should be thinking of other ways of settling our disputes. And we did try to think of such ways after the First World War and after the Second World War, but I think we've begun to forget why we wanted to try and prevent war. I think, as I said earlier, it takes a great catastrophe for us to try and focus our attention. And as time goes by, we forget. And the generations that actually experience the war begin to disappear from the scene. And the next generations don't have the same feeling about it. It's the same thing with the European Union. Those who set up the European Union knew what it was they wanted to avoid, a deeply divided Europe at odds with itself. And now that generation is passing from the scene. And the younger generation think, well, the European Union's always been around. It doesn't mean much to me, and it's there. They don't realize and they don't remember. And it's like a lot of us with the United Nations. I don't think we realize and we remember what it was set up to try and deal with and try and prevent. And I think what is worrying again is we are seeing again one of these great steps forward in our capacity, both to organize ourselves but also our capacity to wage wars. And it seems to me that one of the great next frontiers is going to be cyber war. We're moving into a type of war which I think we don't really fully comprehend. And there are those who worry about it a lot. And a lot of governments are now spending a lot of time thinking about cyber war and how to counter cyber war. We're also dealing increasingly with automated war, with artificial intelligence in wars. And if you want to have a nightmare, there's a very good YouTube video I can recommend to you on killer robots. They're tiny. I mean, they're the size of peas, and they come whizzing around and do frightful things. So I think we are now on an edge where possibly we are now contemplating new kinds of warfare, and I'm not sure we're very good at dealing with it. And I think we've become, as people had become in Europe by 1914, rather complacent, saying we don't do war anymore. It's not the sort of thing we do. It's just something that others do. So yes, they do war in Yemen or they do war in Afghanistan, but we don't do war anymore. And I think we need to be careful, because I think throughout human history we have seen quite peaceable societies move quite quickly from war to peace. And we should remember that in the summer of 1914, it took 5 weeks for a very peaceful Europe to move from peace to all-out major war. So I'll leave you on that cheerful thought. Thank you. Get my bag out of your way.
You're right, Margaret. Well, thank you very much, Margaret. It was a tour de force, and it's not often in life you see someone that has an intellect that is matched by his or her ability to communicate, and you are one such very rare person, Margaret. In fact, I said to the US Charge, who hasn't had the privilege to hear you speak before, I said, you're in for a treat here. And that's exactly what we have had. I'm still struggling with the concept of no soldiers and no dogs and the lunatic asylum of public opinion. But I also, since you were here 4 years ago, and having read the book, The War That Ended Peace, thinking about one of your observations in the lead up to 1914, that crisis tested political masculinity, and I reflected on that somewhat with events that have happened since you published that magnificent tome, which is of course available outside. Now, questions? Just one at a time, please. Yes, at the end there, yes. There's a microphone, so just for the recording purpose, thanks.
Good afternoon, Margaret. Peter Jones. Thanks very much for your presentation. It was really very interesting. Just wanted, can you comment a little bit about, in recent years, we've had a lot of terrorist organisations which has affected global security. Is there anything we can glean from, say, the anarchists of the 19th century, or would you like to just comment on that particular aspect of global security?
It's something they actually had in the 19th century. There were a lot of terrorist attacks in the 19th century. Well, President McKinley in the United States was assassinated by terrorists. The King of Italy was assassinated. The King of Spain was attacked. A lot of Russian governors were attacked. A Russian Tsar was attacked and murdered. This was long before Nicholas II. So I think there was a fear. And what happened in the 19th century, and I think it's a danger of happening here, is that there was such an overreaction. People became very, very nervous that there were terrorists everywhere. And I think they accepted police measures which they would not have accepted or the authorities cracking down, they would not have accepted in normal times. I mean, the whole reason for terrorism is to try and disrupt society. And what terrorists really want, I think, is a demonstration. They want a demonstration. It's a weapon, really, of the weak, I think. But it's a very effective weapon because they want to make societies unstable and insecure. And I think the wave of terrorist attacks we've had recently has been very successful in doing that, and we've been obliged as societies to take measures that I think we wouldn't normally want to take. We've been obliged to accept a greater degree of surveillance than we might feel comfortable with, but I think it's done, because we feel the fear of terrorist attacks. And of course, the likelihood of any of us being killed by a terrorist attack is much less than being run over by a bus. But it's the randomness and the unexpectedness of terrorism that I think spooks us all, and I think rightly does spook us all. But how we deal with it, I think in the end they dealt with it in the 19th century, partly through repression, partly through good police work. And I think the best way to deal with terrorism is to try and deal with it through good policing. And it seems to me there have been some very successful preventions of terrorist acts through very effective intelligence and police work. I myself am very dubious about the notion of a war on terror, because it seems to me it's a metaphor which is not necessarily very helpful. I mean, wars tend to have clear opponents, and they tend to have clear ends in sight. You know, usually one side wins and the other side loses. Someone surrenders, someone imposes a peace. And how do you know that a war of terror is going to end? How do we know when it's ended? It seems to me that perhaps we shouldn't have framed it in those ways, that we should have seen it more as a series of criminal activities. I mean, I tend not even to like to call such people terrorists. I think they're criminals. I think they're murderers, and I think they're criminals, and I think they should be characterized as such. Calling them terrorists, I think, gives them a dignity which they don't deserve. I think they're just mass murderers, most of them, and many deluded. And that's simply my view. But dealing with it, it's not something that there's any easy solution to. But a lot of it, I think, is prevention, not in the sense of trying to re-educate people, but simply trying to be aware of those who might be at risk of becoming radicalized. There's just been a hideous trial in Britain recently, which has been in the press, of a mother and her two daughters who all became terrorists. And they radicalized themselves online, which is very difficult to prevent. But luckily, they came to the attention of the police, and the police monitored them and eventually were able to prevent them from carrying out their terrorist activities. But it seems to me that it's very difficult to come up with a composite picture of a terrorist. It was thought at the time of September the 11th that it was people who were driven into it by poverty. And that was the common explanation. It's the misery in which they live that makes them terrorists. And then it turned out that most of the people who perpetrated, in fact, all the people, I think, who perpetrated the September 11th attacks in the United States were middle-class, educated people. That it wasn't poverty that was driving them necessarily. And so I think we have to be careful in how we try and ascribe the root causes of terrorism. I think we have to recognize that it can come from many different areas, and often, in the case of this mother and the two daughters, from just a dysfunctional family setup where they were driving each other mad in a way, because the mother was totally erratic and the daughters were trying to get her attention, and somehow committing terrorist acts seemed to all to give them a validation and a purpose. But I think there's no easy answer to it. I think it is going to be a long slog, and we're going to see more terrorist activities. And we are open societies, we're easy targets. But we don't want to become too close, because then we become something that we don't want to be. It's a very, very difficult issue to deal with, I think.
Yes, the lady up the back, and then Paul.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your fantastic presentation. There's so many questions, but one. In the policy-making space, what should we be thinking about in those times that we're in?
I'm a great believer in understanding those you're dealing with, which is why I think, and I'm not just saying this because there's so many diplomats here, but I do think it is very important to have good diplomatic services with the deep knowledge of other countries and other societies, which you can only gain, I think, through close and sustained study of those. And I think we should call in the academic expertise as well. I mean, one of the dangers that happens is when we assume that others are just like us, and we assume they're reacting in the same ways. Robert McNamara spent a very long time after he'd retired as Secretary of Defense in the U.S. trying to figure out what went wrong with the American effort in Vietnam. And he concluded one of the big mistakes they made was to assume the Vietnamese were just like Americans and would think in the same ways and react in the same ways. And so I think knowing those you are dealing with is very important indeed. And if you don't understand that, you'll misread the signals badly, or you'll run the danger of misreading the signals. And I think what happens in moments of crisis, and it certainly happened in those last weeks, two weeks before the outbreak of the First World War, is that both sides stopped looking at what was really happening in the other countries and began to think in terms of what they feared. And so the German High Command said, the Russians are getting ready to attack us. They're getting ready to attack us. We knew they'd do it. And so everything Russia did, they read as confirmation of this. You get this tremendous, if you become sort of obsessed with what the other side, you think they're up to no good. Well, they may well be up to no good. But if you don't at least think of alternative explanations. So I think when you become obsessed with what the other side is doing, and everything they do seems to you to feed into a sort of doomsday scenario, then I think it becomes very dangerous indeed. So I do think knowledge and understanding matters enormously in those stages, and trying, Winston Churchill said, jaw is better than war. That doesn't mean you should not prepare for war and not prepare to defend yourself. I mean, sometimes you have to, and sometimes war is unavoidable, as he knew very well. But I think communicating, talking, continuing to try and negotiate as much as you can until it becomes impossible to negotiate, I think is also very important.
The High Commissioner, and then that gentleman.
Thank you, Margaret, for a fascinating presentation. Just a quick dit for you. When I joined the Royal Canadian Navy in 1980, and I was posted out to Victoria, there was a bar down on Douglas Street that said, "No dogs, no sailors."
Oh, really?
Yeah, so that's 1980.
Oh.
And
How funny.
one of the first sailors that I did meet on board my first ship was from Saskatchewan, and I said, "Hey, why did you join the Navy?" And he said, "Well, the judge gave me a choice. It was jail or the Navy." So,
That's interesting.
it's not just 19th century. So I think we've come a long way, though. Look, you made a very compelling argument through the lens of European history around societies reaching a point where they collectively cannot go further in armed conflict, that the suffering, the violence, the destruction, it just reaches a point where men and women decide collectively that this must stop. And if you cast your eye to the Middle East and go back to 1990 and beyond and sort of look at the various wars, the first Gulf War, 9/11, Afghanistan, Iraq, into the failed Arab Spring, and what has happened in Syria. Lebanon is nearly failing, the pressures on Jordan, the roles being played by Turkey, Russia, Iran, the United States. What is your sense there as to how far they might be from coming to the sort of collective realization that they need to stop and find a way to move forward?
I don't know. I find the Middle East at the moment, with some exceptions, very, very discouraging indeed. I mean, I think Egypt, for all its problems, will somehow muddle along. Tunisia remains a bright spot. Morocco is fairly stable. Jordan and Lebanon are extraordinary in the sheer fact of their survival. And they have this enormous problem now, burden, which I think is very unfair, but there's, I think, no avoiding it, of Syrian refugees. It's a huge burden on what are already very divided societies and weak economies. But, the Middle East, I think I was just in Beirut, and the question I got from a Lebanese politician was, when is the outside world going to solve our problems? And I said, it's not. It's going to contribute to them. You're in the part of the world that it's easy for people to interfere with, and there are reasons why they want to interfere with you, oil, of course, but also just strategic importance, location matters. But I think until people in the Middle East start, and there are people in the Middle East who do try and do this, they've got to deal with their own problems. And certainly their problems are made much worse by outside meddling and by outside interference. But the solution is not going to come from the outside entirely. I mean, I think it would help, but I don't think we're going to get it at the moment. It would help if you could get the United States and Russia in particular to try and deal with each other. But I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. In fact, I think the opposite is more likely to happen. I think there are going to be more sort of proxy wars and maneuverings. But I think it's also got to come from within the Middle East, which is why I was hopeful for the Arab Spring. I thought, something is happening. And perhaps not everything. We see the Arab Spring as a failure, but perhaps not everything has failed. That something happened, and it showed an alternative way of organizing society, and it gave a moment of hope. And people don't forget that entirely. And I do think, there are a lot of young people in the Middle East who really do want to make a difference. And the trouble is the problems are so great, and of course the temptation for young people is to leave. And I was talking to a very nice human rights lawyer I know in Beirut, and I said, are you going to retire here? And he said, I'm not sure, because he said all the young are leaving. It's like living in a mausoleum. The educated young get out, and they go to the United States, they go to Canada, they come to Australia, because they don't want to live in that world. But I think the tendency in the Middle East certainly is still perhaps a bit to say it's everyone else's fault. And it certainly is everyone else's fault, but it's also, the solution is going to have to come from within the Middle East, because they're the only people who are really going to care enough. But the prognosis at the moment I don't think is good, because we've also got proxy wars within the Middle East between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And they're making the misery of countries such as Yemen even greater, and Syria, of course, and Iraq, where they're playing out their particular game. So no, I can't be too optimistic about the Middle East at the moment.
Thank you, Margaret. Yes, this gentleman here.
Thank you, Margaret, for your excellent presentation. I'd like to know what your view is, considering we've got autocratic regimes in China, Russia, North Korea, and instability in the Middle East. Do you believe that war is inevitable in the coming months or years?
Well, I don't know. I think there are two kinds of war we're seeing at the moment. We're seeing this highly sophisticated war, which is often state-to-state war, with artificial intelligence, cyber war increasingly, and with automated war.